Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. White has no superiority over black, and black has no superiority over white, except for good actions and piety. This is a quote from the famous last sermon of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he gives in Arafah in the 10th year of Hijri. It's also the quote that is used by many of the Muslims in declaring that Islam has abolished racism 1400 years ago. And so we can dust off our hands and we can sit back and relax because everything that's happening around us does not matter to us. But is that really true? I mean, sure, in our community, alhamdulillah, racism might not look like a knee on the neck, but it might look like a raised eyebrow. It might look like a gesture or a word that we may not even be aware of. Because Islam did not abolish racism. Islam commanded us to abolish racism. That's me and that's you. When we look at the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we see that surely he and his rightly guided companions were able to create a society that was free of tribal prejudices and racial disparities. However, it is because he and the companions, sallallahu alaihi wasallam and radiallahu anhuma, they were able to actively work and make the lessons of Islam into their lives and into the society. Likewise, if we claim to be the followers of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then we too need to actively work on those lessons and get those lessons from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life, his sunnah, the Quran, and actively put them in our lives, in our family, and in our community. So the first problem, or the first way to fix a problem, I should say, is to address that there is an issue. And for that reason, I thank all of you for joining us here today as we join our esteemed panelists to learn and listen what they have to say and what they can teach us about what the problem is, hopefully make us try to understand, and bi'iznillah, we reflect on it and are able to together solve this problem of racism. And with that, I would like to introduce to you our moderator for tonight, my dear friend, a very active community member, and my sister, Zainab Adam. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Zainab.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Mawish, thank you very much. You are an inspiration to all of us, Mawish. Thank you for providing an insight into the background for this event. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Welcome to our panel tonight. We have esteemed panel of speakers, Brother Tariq, Brother Siddiq, and Sister Faheema, who are husband and wife. And then also we have Brother Herzig and Brother Ameer. There will be a question and answers session after the panel discussion. So please enter your questions and comments as you are watching. In total, we do have about an hour and a half for this event. The first part will be the panel discussion, and the questions will come at the end of the panel. So when we look at Islam itself as a way of life, it is international. Our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam surrounded himself with people of all colors, all kinds of groupings. So normally people don't look at Islam from a racial point of view. But because of the racialized world that we live in today, and because of the effects of the Atlantic slave trade and the Americas on the African people, and racism, which came into literature, and even the way we think today, it has made it very, very important for us to bring out important contributions made by African people to the time of our prophets, even before his time, during his time, and even before and even after the time, up until right now. It is very important that especially now for the younger generations who may be confused sometimes on the role of Africa and Islam, we have selected these esteemed panel of leaders who in their own way have also contributed significantly to Muslims in America. So tonight we have Brother Tariq, who will be going first. And a little bit about Brother Tariq. We are fortunate to have him. Brother Tariq, Ustadh Tariq began his formal studies with Ustadh Haisal. Forgive me if I pronounce it wrong, with Ustadh Haisal and Sheikh Mendes in Atlanta. Then traveled to Yemen and studied at the former Badr Institute and Dar al-Mustafa. And he continues to study with other world-renowned sheikhs. Ustadh Tariq currently serves as a chaplain for the Department of Corrections and also teaches at Falah Center in New York City and also at Al-Muwatta in Newark. Ustadh Tariq, thank you so much for joining us. Since you are a chaplain at the Department of Corrections, I was hoping as part of your talk, you could give our community some insights on how we ended up with criminalization of so many Black people in our prisons. Ustadh Tariq, Assalamu alaikum, please begin.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah ta'ala, I hope that everyone can hear me. Bismillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So inshallah ta'ala, that's a very large topic to try to cover in, 15 minutes or so. But inshallah ta'ala, I'll try to give it a general summation. So one of the things that we have to understand is about the formation of the America that we, live in right now, meaning the United States of America. And this is also indicative of other areas, but in particular, the United States of America, is that the United States of America can be described as what some academics would call initially a slave country, differentiating between a country that happens to have slaves or slavery amongst it. And the way that they distinguish between a country being a slave country is that if we look back to American history, one of the primary sources of income, particularly if you look at the southern hemisphere of the United States, the primary source of income, the primary economic backing, the backbone of the society was slavery. And so because of that, that was the means by which, the southern South, gained a good percentage of their wealth. That was, their primary means of gaining wealth. Now, without going into all the details that's associated with it, initially, how it established itself was that initially you had the aspect of indentured servants / slaves. And so initially in America, and this is part of the history that they don't necessarily always talk about, but initially in America, this was not necessarily racially based, meaning that you had some people who were considered to be white that would also end up being in the states of indentured servitude, meaning that they were essentially working for someone else for free until at some point in time that they may be able to gain their freedom. However, eventually, based upon the aspects of trying to maintain an aspect of power within the American society, it became a race-based aspect. And part of the reasoning that many historians look at for this particular basis was that in order to try to make sure that there was never an uprising, or even worse, a coming together of the Black and the white, servants, the indentured servants / slaves, that there was never a time of them coming together such that they would, form some type of uprising or anything of the sort. It became a situation where whiteness became indicative of a higher status, a higher station. And so at this point, slavery now becomes a situation where it's whites versus Black, so to speak. And many of us are familiar with the aspects of the history of slavery and so on and so forth. Again, based upon the time that we don't have the time to go into that. But this is given just a general framework to work with, is that there was a creation of whiteness. Again, there have been many different people who talked about this aspect of the creation of whiteness. Because if you look at some aspects of history, even some aspects of going to other places around the world, what you'll find is that just as Malcolm X would say on his Hajj and things of that nature, is that whiteness in other places may be used as a descriptive attribute, whereas in an American cultural context, it was meant to solidify a type of superiority over another group. So now let's fast forward. Fast forward, we go to the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation takes place at the junction of the Civil War, and the president of that time, Abraham Lincoln, he initiates the Emancipation Proclamation that says that slavery will be abolished. However, there's a little caveat. Some of you may have seen the movie, or the documentary video 13th, or you may have read certain books like Slavery by Another Name, or The New Jim Crow, these type of books that talk about this particular situation, where that's the reason why the documentary is entitled 13th is because in the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, there was a clause that essentially slavery will be abolished. However, from the standpoint of prisoners, from the standpoint of prisons, that there could be an institution of slavery established, meaning that people could essentially be forced to indulge in hard labor without being recompensed for it. And this was a means of punishment for a person committed a crime. Now, why this is extremely significant in our discussion of racism and blackness and whiteness in America is because when this constitutional amendment was placed in there, what happened was that, in particularly in the South, is that, remember we said that America was a slave country, meaning their economic basis was backed by slavery. So when slavery was abolished, it left particularly the South in pretty much ruin economically, because you just gotten rid of their, complete economic system, their primary economic system. So this became a major problem in the South. So what happened was that the aspect of the 13th Amendment of the Constitution was used as a manipulation tool. So what happened was that, particularly in the South, different rules and laws were started to be put in place that allowed for Black people to be imprisoned for trivial matters. Meaning that, for example, if you're a Black man in particular, they were looking for men, because the aspect of the exploitation of the 13th Amendment, the purpose for it was that there was the new business of coal mining and other, very laborious jobs that needed to be filled, and they wanted cheap labor to do so. And so they made trivial laws such that, for example, if a Black man was, standing outside and he couldn't prove that he had a job, that was a means for him to be arrested and placed into prison. Also, they had initiated another type of indentured servitude. For example, in the book Slavery by Another Name, the author, Douglas Blackman, he mentions different examples of situations that occurred where, for example, a Black man may be accused of owing a debt to a white man, and they had court systems set up such that they could be taken and placed into servitude for however many extended years that was, required by that individual. So now what happens is that you have these prisons that are now starting to be able to be filled, and it creates a basically free source of labor. Now you add on to that from that perspective, they are also expendable. Why? Because they can work them for however long they want. And if they die, then it doesn't matter. They can just replace them. And so what this does is that it creates the criminalization effect of African Americans, where now we need to fill these prisons up because now we need to substitute the slave economy that we just got rid of. We need to replace that with something. And again, I'm just giving you one aspect of, American history in that regard. So now we need to replace that with something, and we have to keep it filled to a certain level. And so in order to do that, we have to consistently have laws in place that will make sure that they are filled. And so this creates a situation where the criminalization of Black people becomes more and more prevalent. So now Black people are not just a source of property and a source of free labor, but now they're a source of criminalization. Because in order to do these type of things, you have to have the greater society behind you. And so this was going on in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And again, I have to give a very, brief, history of this. But this is going on in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And then, as you move along, you have the aspects of, the different eras within, Black history in terms of, the Renaissance and, all these type of things. However, you still have this basis of this prison industrial complex that, the prisons still need to be filled. And so what happens is that as, time goes along, any time that you see progress in certain Black neighborhoods, generally speaking, is shot down. So some people, they may have never even heard of Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street was actually an area where you had very prominent African Americans who had reached a certain economical height, so to speak. Not necessarily a height, but they had a large economic, a strong economic community. That whole area was burnt down to the ground. And it was burnt down by, racist whites. And, you have the aspect of, things of the nature of drugs being introduced into the Black community. So for example, you have the aspect of cocaine and heroin being introduced in the Black community. And so what happens is that you get an aspect of resentment from the standpoint of African American communities, because what this does is that African Americans, they start understanding that when we try to go about doing something in a correct manner, in a proper manner, we take the necessary means, because you also have the issue of, for example, the real estate markets that was actually corrupted to exploit Black people. Is that when you have the situation, you have some individuals, the likes of, for example, the likes of someone like Malcolm X, who they'll come to the point of understanding that it makes no sense for me to go about trying to, assimilate into or try to get into the society of the greater, white society that is systematically against me. And so you have some who go into a criminal element, kind of as a rebellion to what they see as the, alternative, which, again, is not indicative to the success of Black people. Now, the thing is that, not everyone has, that initial, response, because, even Malcolm X, he eventually comes out of that type of thinking. But again, it's laying down some of the framework. But then you have other situations, for example, when groups like the Black Panthers and other groups, and the Black Panthers, to give a very brief history about the Black Panthers, is that the Black Panthers, they initially established themselves as being a community service organization. That was the primary goal. The primary goal was, self-defense, in terms of, just like we're seeing today, where they were going to be a source of policing the police, in the Black neighborhoods, as well as providing, much needed support in the Black neighborhood. But then what do you have? You have infiltration of the Black Panthers, and they infiltrated them not just with, police and other things, but they also infiltrated them with drugs and also setups and these type of things. And so now, again, you have this feeling of the prison system and so on and so forth. Now this transfers over to the 1980s. In the 1980s, that's when you have the aspect of the war on drugs, the 1980s going into the 90s. Now what happens is that, in order to, fuel still this prison industrial complex that America still has, now we have to figure out, new ways, because, during the 50s and 60s, even, this was the primary time of the civil rights movement. Some of the things that were allowed previously were not going to be necessarily tolerated on a national level in the 80s and 90s and so on and so forth. So now you have to kind of take a different spin on it. And then the 80s and 90s, that different spin became the war on drugs. And if you see, it created a situation where, overwhelmingly people from African American communities were placed into prison at an exorbitant rate, more than any other group. And at the same time, these are the same communities that, you had an exorbitant rate of drugs being pumped into the community. And so it was one of those things where it was a situation where no matter what type of way that, African Americans, Black people in America tried to go, it was a situation where they were kind of set up for failure. And so this, attributes to this aspect of, this prison industrial complex. Like I said, there's a lot that has to be drawn out. This is why I would recommend, for example, if a person is not familiar, you can read the book Slavery by Another Name. If I'm not mistaken, they also have a documentary for it as well, Slavery by Another Name. You also have the documentary 13th. You also have the book by Michelle Alexander, which is The New Jim Crow. But this is something that goes on today. As it was mentioned, I work in a prison. And right now, still to this day, the African American community represents the largest ethnic group in the prison. Now, the thing is that, again, someone can say, well, what, did they do to end up in prison and so on and so forth. But as you can see, this is not, something that just happened, haphazardly. This is something that is generational, that has contributed to African Americans, Black people in this country being, largely targeted in terms of being placed in the prison system. And this continues. And if you want to talk about from the standpoint of the Muslims, if I want to be technical, the Muslims in the prison system, particularly in the prison system I work at, we represent the largest group of any religious group. The Black, Black people in the prison system, the Muslims among them represent the largest religious group. There are more Muslims than there are Christians in the prison that I work in. So this is a situation that is not just affecting, Black people just themselves, but it's also affecting Muslims. And so this is, again, just a very brief, introduction to this concept of the prison industrial complex in America that goes way back to the aspect of slavery. And so the thing is that, one of the primary aspects of it was based upon the economic value system of America, but race was one of the primary tools used to enforce that. And so now we find ourselves in this situation where you have this, criminalization of African Americans. Because as we mentioned before, in order for, the greater American society to continue to be able to do this, you have to demonize the people who you are, massively incarcerating. It's just like when, America or any other country goes to war. One of the first things that they'll do is that they'll create a space for propaganda. Whereas you get the people to see whoever the enemy is as being the enemy. This way, whatever, harm that you cause to that people, then it will be accepted by the rest of society. I mean, just think of the mindset of, American society, where you have a situation where, a Black person can be lynched in broad daylight, surrounded by a group of people, and they're taking pictures, by the body of an individual. I mean, it's not something that's, pleasant to think about, but this is the mind frame that was set in that, in the society. And yes, we've, come, some way from that, but those reminiscences are still very prevalent, you know. And as an African American male, as a Black male, you know, and as Black females, you know, this is something that we live with all the time, whether or not we recognize it or not, or whether or not, you know, we like to speak about it or not. You know, this is a reality that we go through, you know, just like, you know, I'm sure, you know, particularly during this time, we hear about people saying, like, you know, particularly people who have African American children, having the talk with them, essentially how to make sure that you can be safe being an African American, being a Black person in America.
Right.
So inshallah ta'ala, we'll stop here, and I'll let, you know, the others, you know, give their give better insight than I can. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wasallam.
MashaAllah, Brother Tariq. Tabarakallah. This is very, very insightful. Thank you so much for enlightening us, including myself, about something I've never heard before. For sure, I'm sure we are going to have you again and all of the panelists, speakers. And I would like for you to share the links and the books that you recommended during your talk towards the end of the discussion. And once again, I'm reminding all of you that there will be question and answers, please. So please do type in your questions as it comes. And alhamdulillah, I'm going to introduce you to our second and third speakers, their husband and wife. We are blessed to have them, Brother Siddiq and his wife, Sister Faheema. So Brother Siddiq is a retired captain from Plainfield Police Division in New Jersey. He earned his master's degree at Rutgers University and has served as a counselor in the Educational Opportunities Fund program at Rutgers. In 1994, Brother Siddiq El-Amin was appointed to the position of Director of Public Affairs and Safety, making him the second Muslim to hold a governmental position in the city of Plainfield. His wife, Sister Faheema, was also an elected city councilwoman in the past and was also elected as president of the city council. She is the past vice president also of the Union County Women's Political Caucus and a supporting member of the National Organization of Black Enforcement. Both Sister Faheema and Brother Siddiq now serve on the Majlis Ashura of Masjidullah in Plainfield. Without further ado, Brother Siddiq, Sister Faheema, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. With that, we weren't given an exact topic to talk about. However, we were mentioned to talk about our journey into Al-Islam and how that happened. So I'll let my wife start out first, since she was came into to the community of Al-Islam back in the 70s before I did.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak with you this evening. I just wanted to say that I am from Alabama initially. I am from a working class family. We considered blue collar. My parents were blue collar workers. There are 5 of us children and my parents. We were homeowners at that time. I went to segregated schools. So we learned Black history. Racism was the way of life in Alabama at that time. We also went to church every Sunday. I was a Baptist. I went to church all day, taught Sunday school in the mornings and training units in the evenings. There were 2 religions growing up for me. There was the Methodist religion and the Baptist religion. We happened to be Baptists. There were 2 ethnic groups. There were the Caucasian groups and the African American groups. So I did not know anything about Islam or Muslims. When I graduated high school, I moved to New York with my uncle and his family. That's when I learned about Islam and Muslims. I started doing some research on Islam in 1968. 1969, I had made a decision that I wanted to become a Muslim. I then joined the Nation of Islam in 1970. What I did find out about racism was that it's every place. It's not just in Alabama. It's every place. It was in New York, believe it or not. And you know, it's in Al-Islam also. But what was most important, I found out that the racism is not about the religion, it's about the individual. What was so beautiful about Islam was that I found that Allah does not judge, as we know, by your color of your skin, but by the contents of your heart. He is the only one that can see our heart. So Islam has been beautiful for me. I made my Hajj in 1992. I also had Umrah. I made Umrah in 2019. So Islam has been my way of life for many, many years. And I'm grateful to Allah that He chose me to be Muslim. So in that, I'll let my husband speak.
Thank you, my lovely wife, Faheema. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My background in growing up was completely the opposite of my wife. I grew up in a very wealthy town in New Jersey in Union County, where there was maybe 5–10% African Americans, Black people at that time. I was not really exposed to racism growing up, although I did not live in the best part of town. We lived in a 4-room apartment. My mother, my father, my brother, and my sister. We had a coal stove in the living room and a coal stove in the kitchen. And so that's the kind of environment that we had. We were very loving to each other. We did not know that we were poor. We just knew that we didn't have a lot of money. And so my mother and father, they both worked hard. They provided the best that they could for us. We were very happy growing up in our home. And I followed my older brother, who was 4 years ahead of me. And he showed me athletics, and I followed his footsteps. He was an athlete growing up in high school and a star, and went on to college. And I followed some 4 years later. And I had a group of friends that I grew up with, and we basically were dominant in our athletic teams, football, basketball, and track, enough so that most of us earned scholarships. And that is how we were able to go to college without putting a financial burden on our parents. And it wasn't until I was really in college that I got exposed to some racism. When we were freshmen on the football team and we would play other colleges, that's when we heard some racial epithets cast our way. My buddies, when we get together and talk about it, their memory is a lot clearer than mine. I've pretty much erased that memory tape. So I have to rely on them to bring up the good stories that we talk about. But I was fortunate in that I graduated from Rutgers. I was able to secure a job in education. I was a teacher for a while. And even there, I started noticing some more exposure to racism. I worked in a predominant white school system in a white township. That then too gave me some more awakening. One of my students at the time, he was in the Nation of Islam. His whole family was, by the way. And he would bring me, I was a physical education teacher, and he would bring me copies of the Muhammad Speaks newspaper. And at the same time, I was taking a graduate course at Rutgers called A History of Religions. And I was studying all the religions because I was never really comfortable with Christianity. My mother was a pastor, an evangelical pastor. My father, he wasn't, he was religious, but he wasn't a zealot. So it just didn't stick with me. My brother and sister, it stuck with them, but alhamdulillah, it wasn't my path. And it wasn't until I was in the educational system and teaching and taking that course that I saw that the religion that my ancestors, the religion of my ancestors was El-Islam. And coupling that with the Muhammad Speaks newspapers, I knew that I wanted to go to Islam. And the Islam that I knew at the time in the early 70s was the Nation of Islam. And so I joined the Nation of Islam in 1970 in New Jersey. My wife joined in New York and Brooklyn. And it wasn't until 1971 that we met each other in New Jersey, in New Jersey. And from that point on, we've been together for 48 years. I have to check with her, you know, sometimes on that. But in terms of discrimination and racism, our experiences have been different, yet similar, in that as a young man in the Nation of Islam and working at Rutgers, there weren't that many Muslims at Rutgers at the time in the early 1970s. It didn't start to flourish until the 80s and the 90s. And I was there in Rutgers until 1975, and then I left and became more active in the community of Plainfield and the Muhammad's Mosque at the time in Plainfield. And it wasn't until 1975 when the Honorable Elijah Muhammad returned to Allah and his son, Minister Wallace Muhammad, became the leader that we, my wife and I, and the community that we're involved with, began to make the transition to the worldwide community proper of al-Islam, alhamdulillah. And that set us on our path today, that we're on today and have been on all those years. As a part of that, in 1980, I joined the Plainfield Police Division. I was one of the first Muslim to be a police officer in that agency. I met other brothers and sisters at the time, and they joined the police division. And we were still looked at somewhat with a side eye, as it said. But nevertheless, we persevered. We overcame obstacles, and we were able to advance our careers in law enforcement in the city of Plainfield, being promoted to sergeant, being promoted to lieutenant. And at one point in time, I was as was mentioned, the public safety director in the city of Plainfield. And that afforded me the opportunity to be the head person over the police division and the fire division and the division of inspections. So it gave me an opportunity to really expand my leadership skills and also to interact with more and more people. At the same time, I also knew that I had to form some alliances for survival. And I became a member of a Black law enforcement organization that became known as the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And there I met Black leaders, both Christian and Muslim, across the country that were able to share skills and techniques and insight to me to develop my career as an individual, as a man, and as a Muslim. At this point, I'll give it back to my wife, and she'll pick up from there, and then we'll sort of put a wrap on it.
Well, from there, after we were married and started our family, my husband was on the force. He did join the force after we were married. So that was a good thing. That meant that we had benefits. We had health insurance. And we also had futures, you know, the 401ks and all those good things that come with having a decent job when you don't work for yourself. But during that time, I also started my own business. I started a family childcare business in my home. And later on, after my children were all out of the house, I opened a childcare center where I owned that center. We owned the center actually for 14 years. From there, once we closed and sold that business, I am now a manager at a childcare resource agency where I teach women to also start a small business in their home, and they too can become successful. So that's what I do right now on a regular basis. We also manage a soup kitchen. We're at Masjidullah. I'm one of the co-founders of the Muslim Community Soup Kitchen. We started that back in 1989 when I was campaigning for city council. We became incorporated, and now we are thriving. We are blessed to have wonderful people volunteering and working with us. Every Saturday we feed from 70 to 90 people. The numbers are growing. We are very happy in this community. We love to serve. We have a name for ourselves as Masjidullah of serving the community. And we're so grateful that Allah chose us to work in this field. We have some wonderful volunteers. I won't name names, but some of our sisters who started out with us back in 1989 are still with us today. I guess we're pillars in Plainfield as Muslims. We've been here a long time. We've served in the community. We've been elected officials. We still serve the community. And inshallah, we will continue to do that because there's such a need. And there is a need for Muslims to be out there in the forefront, leading the way for our communities. And with that, I thank you. Our children are all adults. We have one police officer in the family, another police officer in the family.
Actually, we had two at one time. Our son was first as a police officer in New York for about 6 years before relocating to Texas. Our youngest child, our daughter, she also joined the Plainfield Police Division, and she is a sergeant there now, and she's a leader in that agency as well, and respected. We both serve on the Masjidullah Islamic Center in Plainfield. We've been there since 1970. We just finished celebrating our 50th anniversary as Masjidullah in Plainfield. And we are now poised to expand our reach Islamically as a total community under the great leadership that we have there at our Majlis and our Imam. I must give him a shout out because you'll be seeing him next week, and that is Imam Khalil Abdul Aziz. But he stands on the shoulders of the longest serving Imam we had for 35 years, Imam Abdul Wali Muhammad. And both of them have set the foundation and established our Islamic community in Plainfield and in Union County as one of the leaders in terms of the Muslim community in Union County and New Jersey. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
Thank you so much, Sister Faheema and Brother Siddiq. What a remarkable journey. MashaAllah. You are an inspiration to all of us.
Alhamdulillah.
And Tabarakallah for performing Hajj. MashaAllah. May Allah give us the chance to visit his house all the time. And I pray that this COVID-19 gets eradicated and resolved quickly so that we can be able to visit the house of Allah. Thank you so much once again. So for our fourth speaker that we are blessed to have is Dr. Herzig. Brother Herzig is a psychologist in the Boston, Massachusetts area. He has practiced in community health centers, emergency rooms, schools, state hospitals, and federal prisons. Dr. Herzig has authored several academic journals and is a reviewer for the Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development and the Journal of Muslim Mental Health. He also serves on the Journal of Muslim Mental Health and the Board of Health and Intersection of Islam and Mental Health. Brother Herzig, we are all excited to hear from you, your unique insights regarding the racial issues we all are facing. Brother Herzig, to hear from you, your unique insights regarding the racial issues we all are facing.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So, I appreciate the invitation. I am cognizant of the fact that my voice is a white voice on this panel. And I want to just kind of acknowledge that at first, that there's a privilege that goes along with being invited to speak. And my understanding is that somebody had reached out to Sheikh Mendez, who had said, oh, you should probably have somebody who's white be able to speak on your panel. And so if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. Again, I want to just acknowledge that and thank you for including me, and thank you all for your openness and your vulnerability in teaching us and in sharing your stories. So as the sister mentioned, I'm also a clinical psychologist. I practice in the Boston area, and I may be able to provide some insight from that background as well. So I grew up in the Boston area. My parents actually were an interfaith marriage from the beginning, which was kind of unusual back then. My dad describes himself, to use his term, as hippie Jewish. So very secular Jewish, very social justice oriented, certainly in the 60s and 70s, more counterculture oriented. And my mother grew up in a very strict Catholic family, where she was one of 10 kids. And it was church every Sunday. And one side of her family actually came over, the non-Catholic side actually came over on the Mayflower. So we have pretty deep roots, at least for white folks in this country. As we know, there are a lot of folks whose roots run much deeper than that in this country. So I grew up actually in a very social justice minded household. And from the beginning, there was no religion that was really pushed on us, but there was a message about social justice, about education, about effecting change, and about understanding privilege. And that's just kind of, that's who my parents are. Like, you go by their house nowadays, it's a leafy suburban street and everybody has nice front lawns. And there's one house in the middle of the street that has the big Black Lives Matter sign on the lawn. That's us, and they were telling me about how they went on a tour of the South, as the brother was talking about lynching in the South, that they as white people wanted to go see for themselves kind of everything that happened so they could feel that more personally. And that's the spirit with which I was raised. And when I was 12, I became interested in Islam. Actually, my favorite basketball player at the time, his name is Mahmoud Abdul Rauf. He was my favorite player ever. I loved his game. For those of you who are from the next generation, look at some highlights on YouTube. He was like Steph Curry. If he played in today's game, he'd average 30 a game. And he was my favorite player. And he also had Tourette's syndrome, which is a neurological condition which causes twitching and verbal tics. And my sister had that as well. So my mother was very involved with the local Tourette's Syndrome Association. And Mahmoud was somebody who was very supportive. And so when he came to Boston to play the Celtics that year, we actually had some contact through the Tourette's Syndrome Association, and got in touch with him. I said I wanted to talk to him, and we did. We met before the game, and to me as a kid, the model of somebody who's making millions of dollars and doesn't know you, who's still making time for you and cares about you, to me that model was enough to tell me what Islam was about. I didn't need guidance about race as it pertained to Islam. And the sister was mentioning during the introduction that, we have these hadith and these verses in the Quran that speak to the unity of all peoples. I had already been taught that. I didn't need Islam to tell me what didn't matter. I needed to learn what did matter. And so the message of racial equality in Islam was something that was confirming, but was not life-changing. And we as Muslims, I think we sometimes look at those verses and those hadith as cop-outs. You know, we say, well, we don't really need to think about race because we figured that out like 1400 years ago. And so everybody just read the Quran and then you'll get it. And there's a difference between, you know, striving for racial equality, which is, I think, what we're all on right now as Muslims. There's a difference between equality and justice. So we talk a good game about equality. We talk about how, in theory, everybody is equal in the eyes of God. But we don't necessarily do our homework and understand everything that's gone on in the history of race in this country. And you know, Brother Tariq, I think, elucidated a lot of that. But when we're in school, you know, our learning about race goes something like this. If you're in a white suburban neighborhood, it's, we had slavery and slavery was bad, but then Lincoln freed the slaves. And then we had Jim Crow, but Jim Crow was bad, but then Martin Luther King marched and we got a Civil Rights Act passed. And then there was still some racism, but we elected a Black president. So now we're kind of in this post-racial world, and yeah, there's like a little bit of bad stuff here and there, but it's no longer endemic to our system. It's no longer systemic. You know, we've moved past most of it. And I think that what you've seen over the past few weeks and maybe even over the past few years is that there are a lot of white people, well-meaning white people, who had lived under that message and who are being woken up a little bit to the ways in which racism is so deeply ingrained in the American story and still is today. And in a way, this was something about Islam that appealed to me because I felt that there was a social justice message in Islam. It's not about equality, but when we think about justice, we think about creating a society where what counts, you know, one's heart, one's spirit, where what counts is what matters and not anything else. And when we look at the life of Prophet ﷺ, he was seen as a threat. He was seen as a threat in Mecca because he was coming with a message that upended the existing social order of the time, where there were so many people who were powerful and who were comfortable within that existing social order, even though that social order was based on very skewed values. And what he was proposing was, in essence, a paradigm shift, right? He was saying the foundations that underpin your idea of what social order should be, we need to get rid of those foundations. And we need to replace it with an entirely new understanding of what makes people valuable and of what we should strive toward as a society. And in a way, we're seeing a little bit of that now in this country, where there's this challenge where we're basically saying, let's strip away everything we know about race foundationally, and let's question whether or not there's another reality that we can come to understand better that will move us toward justice. And so that message of social justice that I grew up with, you know, was something that helped me embrace Islam and was something and is something that energizes me today, you know, certainly over the past couple of weeks. So, and this whole idea of challenging assumptions, shifting paradigms, that's very much at the heart of my work as a psychologist. As a psychologist, what we're looking at are kind of the internal systems of oppression. You know, when people feel depressed, when people feel anxious, there are powers that are external to them that are intruding on them. And what we propose then is to challenge those assumptions, to challenge those thoughts, and to create a better emotional experience by questioning whether or not all of the presumptions that we've been living under in terms of how we think about ourselves and how we think about our relationships and our problems, to really question whether there are more valid and more adaptive ways to think about those things. And so that's what we do in the work of psychology. But I want to say, even coming into Islam, particularly at a young age, there was still white privilege that was involved there too. You know, I remember my parents, they were very supportive. I remember the only time I ever saw my mom pulled over by a cop was she was trying to get me to Salatul Jummah. I was probably like, you know, 17 or something like that. She was driving me and a cop pulled her over, and he didn't even run her plate. He didn't even, say, ma'am, you have to wait in the car. He just said, is everything okay? You seem to be going kind of fast. And she's like, oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. And then it was, okay, have a nice day, ma'am. And that was the police interaction. And that was, even then, my experience about what the typical police interaction looks like. It's officer friendly. They notice something that's amiss, and so they just kind of stop by and make sure everything's good. They give you a very gentle warning, and you're on your way. And you know what? We made it. We made it to the masjid. There are a lot of people who in that situation would have never made it to the masjid because that police interaction would have gone down a different way. That's something I didn't totally understand at the time. But the other thing is that when you are white and you're young and you are a convert to Islam, and you go to like a suburban masjid, and this is my story, your whiteness is actually, like, weirdly, it's kind of celebrated. Like, it's almost fetishized. Like, here's this guy, mashallah, he's white, he didn't know anything about Islam, then he became Muslim, mashallah. And, and his family came over on the Mayflower, like, okay, we got one. Now Islam can be as American as apple pie because we got this kid and he's like American as apple pie too. And it shows that even we had these convoluted notions of race within an otherwise educated, well-meaning Muslim community that wound up putting me on a pedestal. And, when I graduated from Sunday school, I was like the one who, got the special award at the end, and I became known. And as a teenager, that feels great. It feels great. Looking back on it, I thought it was an example of privilege. And, I questioned, had I been African-American and showed up in that masjid, what would the reaction have been? I never thought of that at the time. And I still don't know. And, even I felt like my whiteness and my privilege was celebrated when I went on Hajj. And I'll tell you a brief story. I went on Hajj when I was 22. And this was actually the first Hajj after the US had invaded Iraq in 2003. And Muslims were not, and Americans were not popular in the Muslim world. And Americans were not popular in Saudi Arabia, or at least America wasn't. And so I was out like that first morning, I had gone like to make tawaf, and then I went around and I explored the city of Mecca. And I just wanted to walk around and get the lay of the land. And anybody who's been there knows that it's got these like windy roads and little shops, and I just wanted to get a feel for it. And I got stopped by a Saudi policeman. And he gave me this look like, and he said, "Where are you from?" And I thought, oh man, like this guy, he's gonna see that I'm American, he's gonna be mad at me, what's gonna happen? What's the number to the American embassy so they can save me? And I said, like, I'm American. And he looked at me with a big smile. He's like, how do you like it here? Is everybody treating you the right way? Mashallah, we're so glad. I hope that, it's like he was trying to get my approval. If I was an African-American, I don't know if that's what the reaction would have been. But here I am as like a white American. And all of a sudden, my opinion and my approval is so important. And I was let off like with a handshake, instead of somebody lecturing me about, whatever, are you where you're supposed to be? So this is, the issues of race are, they're intertwined with my own story. They're intertwined with my own life, in that, I'm married to an African-American woman, and have 3 kids. And because, now I can say like half my family is Black, that's led me, I think at times, to let my guard down around my own privilege, because I can say like, well, I'm not one of the bad ones. I'm not one of the racist ones, right? Look at my life, look at my story. And in reality, the past few weeks has caused me to check that again and to question, how complicit might you be in the system of white supremacy that we have in this country, even if you feel like you're one of the good ones, even if externally you have all of the markings of being one of the good ones. And so that involves a lot of listening on my part. And I also have found that as a psychologist, listening is a big part of that work as well. And I can tell you what I'm hearing right now from my African-American clients. What I'm hearing is I am emotionally exhausted. I just can't take this. Everybody wants me to be strong. I do not have the energy to co-author your company's statement against racism. I do not have your energy. I do not have enough energy to, share my reading list with you, like I mean, I will, but just know that I'm also crying inside while you're trying to be good to me. I don't have the emotional energy to be your encyclopedia of equality. I just need to feel cared for right now. And that's what I'm hearing from folks. And I feel like that's a really sincerely held belief that, perhaps individuals who are watching or who are on this panel can relate to. And from the folks who I meet with who are white, a lot of them are saying, you know what, I feel horrible too, but I don't want to voice my own emotions about this because I don't want to prioritize myself. I want to prioritize, my Black brothers and sisters for whose equality I'm looking to support. But I'll tell you what, when they're with me and they're talking to me about how they feel, they let it all out. And white people are feeling this too. Not in the same way that African Americans do. And they will never be able to feel it in the same way that African Americans do. They don't have the lived experience. They don't have the history. They don't have the omnipresent threat. But there's a lot of sympathy there. And, perhaps Islam can be a common link through which we can all understand that. So with that, I will turn it back over to the panel.
MashaAllah, thank you very much. Brother Herzig, this is also another inspirational, insightful story and journey for you. We do have question and answers, so please keep them coming. And we have question and answers, in fact, for everybody, for Brother Herzig, Sister Faheema, Brother Siddiq, and Brother Tariq. So now our next and final speaker before our question and answers is, alhamdulillah, we have the opportunity to listen and learn from Imam Amin Muhammad. Imam Amin is a native of Atlantic City, right here in New Jersey, and serves as the Imam of Masjid Muhammad, which is the oldest mosque in southern New Jersey. Imam Amin has spent more than a decade studying the Islamic sciences with scholars from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Lebanon. He has studied with Sheikh Salah ad-Din al-Idlibi and so many other esteemed, renowned sheikhs. Imam Amin is known for his community involvement at the grassroots level and teaches Islamic theology and several other areas. Without further ado, Imam Amin, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What did I do?
I'm unmuted. Is my picture there? No picture? No voice?
Voice, but no.
Let me go back out and come back in. I think there's a problem. Oh, no, I don't have to do that. Okay. Now, there we go. MashaAllah. Is everything clear?
Yes.
Okay. Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. أسأل الله تبارك وتعالى أن يجعل نياتنا خالصة لوجهه الكريم. First, let me thank the host and all those who arranged this program. I think it's a very important program, and alhamdulillah, I had the opportunity to listen to all our speakers and guests, our brother and colleague, Sayyidi Tariq, Ameer, and our elders in Islam, Sister Faheema and Brother Siddiq, El-Amin, and our brother Islam, Dr. Ben. Jazakumullahu khairan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward all of you. And as I want to talk about the subject more directly than talking about myself and my experiences, which really are not any different from most inner city African-American or Black Muslims or Black people. I have a saying that I say all the time. The issues of Black people in America around the world are the same as issues of Black Muslims in America and Black Muslims around the world. I uttered the Shahada when I was 10 years old, and that was in 1980. So I'm 50 years old now. So I have 40 years of Islamic experience, and that experience comes from in America and all over the Arab world. And in my studies, I've met Muslims, both common people and scholars from every space across the globe. And I'm in a unique situation in that I was able to be exposed to things that most of our people, I mean, African Americans or Black Americans, were not exposed to. So when I speak, oftentimes I speak from my experience, which I've been behind the scenes. You know, we have this saying about a lot of our Islamic conferences and things that we have. We have a joke among our Imams and Shuyukh that that's the show. And every show has behind the scenes. What you see on the show always don't represent what is really happening. So I oftentimes, my experience is from what I know, not what is portrayed. And I, in speaking to this term, even though as a activist and a community leader in Atlantic City, and we're addressing racial issues, I'm also concerned about addressing racial issues within the Muslim community. Because just as white supremacy is a problem in the general society, white supremacy and the traces of white supremacy through different other cultures, whether they be Arab, whether they be from the subcontinent, whether even sometimes they are Africans from Africa, not descendants of ex-slaves taken from Africa, or Black Americans. Black Americans have a unique history that sometimes is not focused upon. And it's glossed over when it comes to the struggles in all aspects of life of Black American Muslims, as well as Black American people. So I want to quickly touch on some things as our brother Tariq talked about the history of Black people in general through slavery, indentured servitude, systemic racism, the difference between whiteness and Blackness in the industrial prison complex, all of which itself is a separate discussion. Every one of those matters deserves its own independent discussion and study and research, and then have solutions. What I am never in favor of is glossing over issues. And I think we have a tendency to gloss over hard issues because we don't want to tackle them and deal with our own contribution to the suffering that we talk about, we want to remove. Because sometimes we are in an implicit way active in furthering these tragic situations and the system that creates them or that allows them to exist. So when we're talking about Muslims in particular, because we're talking about our Ummah, so we can talk about the Ummah as the Ummah that was sent to the Prophet was sent to, that's every person from his time to the day of judgment, or we can talk about those who accepted his call, because we have two types of Ummah. Ummatu Da'wah and Ummatu Ijaba. These are two types of the Ummah of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So what I would like to do is get directly into the systemic racism within the Muslim community. And when I say that, that's not just in America, that's all around the world. I had a call earlier today from one of my students who was from the Desi community, and he was questioning me about, he was concerned about my recent strong emphasis on empowering Black Muslims in the Muslim ranks. And a lot of us, we indicate things, but we don't say them because we think it's not Islamic or it's not good adab, good mannerisms to speak truth. But we learn in our Islamic tradition, قُلِ الْحَقِّ وَلَوْ كَانَ مُرًّا, speak the truth even if it's bitter. And we have a serious systemic racist problem among Muslims. It's not Islam, it is Muslims who don't implement Islam. And this is a big issue that we need to address. And we need to not deal with it in a superficial manner where we apologize for our own transgressions. No, apologies are not enough, as we've seen in a society. We need change. We need change, and we need change now. Let us talk about that. The average Muslim in the African American community, whenever they have interactions with an immigrant community, in whether those immigrants are visiting their masjids or those immigrants are in the suburbs where most of those communities are established, there is a separation between the immigrant community, whether they're Arab from the subcontinent, Asian, Pakistani, Bengali, or even African communities. And that's why you have communities that are predominantly African-American with African-American leadership, and you have communities that are Pakistani or in Bangladeshi or Arab. And when you have a mixture, you always find in that mixture 9 times out of 10, or you can probably say 9.5 times out of 10, that the African American is at the lowest part of that structure within that masjid. And when they go, they are also made to feel as if I am not really a part. I'm a Muslim, and so I'm welcome as a Muslim, but as a Black man or a Black woman, I really don't have real involvement in this community. And this is not Islam. This is not the Islam that Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam brought, but it's a defect inside Muslims that we have to fix. And I wanted to go in details about these things, but with the time limit, all we can do is open the can a little bit and get some air in it so we can go further in the discussion. One of the things that I fear in our communities is that if we don't really have a talk about racism among the ranks of the Muslim, we're going to see a Black Muslims' lives matter or Black Muslim matter movement within the Islamic community. And I believe that we need to have that discussion. We need that movement because every single Muslim among the African American community who has had frequent interaction with Muslims from other backgrounds could tell you this story if they be completely honest. Even if it is their perception that they want to believe, they cannot say they've never felt it. And as I mentioned, I listened to our sister Faheema and brother Siddiq, and they indicated racism in Islam. And I wrote it down because she said, it isn't Islam, it is in individuals. So that is something that we need to address because that's an elder sister among the African-American Muslims who indicated that she felt that. And I know my brother Tariq, if he's talked about it, he can tell you the same thing, that he's even had the taste of it in the Arab world, because he did travel, he stays in the suburbs, he knows the feelings. So for us, I think there's a certain thing that we need to do. Number one, we should first define what is Islam, not just in theory, but in practice. How do we live Islam? How do we get ummatun wahida? How do we get that one ummah? How do we have real ideology, realization of the fact when Allah says, innamal mu'minuna ikhwa, verily only the believers are brethren. How do we realize that? Al-Muslim akhu Muslim, the Muslim is the brother of the other Muslim. La yu'minu ahadakum hatta yuhibbu li akhihi ma yuhibbu li nafsi. You really don't believe until you want for your fellow brother and sister in Islam what you want for yourself. How do we realize that? That's great, quoting verses of the Quran, quoting hadith, but how does that become the reality with which we live? And I think to address that, and I'm not able to attack it and dissect it in this short time the way it needs to be, but is a reality that we really all know. So the point that I want to highlight is, number one, Islam, we all know, doesn't support or advocate or accept racism, bias, classism. All of these things are haram. That is something that's unlawful. It's something ma'lum min ad-din bid-darura, necessarily known in the religion. Islam doesn't accept it. The Quran rejects it. The hadith of the Prophet rejects it. There's scholarly consensus that we don't accept these things. But why do we find it? If all our religious sources, from the Quran, the Sunnah, consensus, all of these major sources of Islamic law and how we derive legal rulings, why does it still exist? Why is it well known that there is one set of information or action or acceptance, even information, that's a whole nother discussion. In Islamic learning and knowledge, there's racism. And the transfer of knowledge, who gets to be with the scholars, who gets to be in the sessions of learning, there's racism in that. And I'm speaking as a person who has studied at various levels in institutions throughout the Islamic world, in sessions where I was the only Black. And I know that feeling. I know that feeling very well. And as Brother Dr. Ben mentioned, white privilege, that's real. I've seen it. So them feelings that he wondered about a Black African-American Muslim in the suburbians, any Black Muslim, if he be honest, you talk with him, he can tell you it's not the same feeling. He's not treated special. Just the other night, we had a discussion with the Imam of one of the largest African-American communities in America, Imam Suleiman Hamid of the Atlanta Masjid of Islam. And he told the story of when his parents sent him to a Pakistani school to learn Quran, and he wasn't comfortable at all. And that's how he ended up in the Sister Clara Muhammad School in Atlanta. And I could tell you the same thing as traveling and being in sessions. I see the disparity. I know even now when we have great scholars, they come to America, great religious scholars who can teach a lot. They will be in the suburbs with the wealthy, predominantly either white communities or immigrant communities, and the Black communities are left without this types of resources. In terms of economics, those Black communities are suffering, and no one as a community effort, as an Ummah, says we have plenty of money, but we won't support and assist our brothers in Islam. We don't have to just say Black. Those brothers in Islam happen to be Black, but first and foremost, we are brothers and sisters in Islam. Why is there such a disparity and wealth gap between the suburban communities, which are predominantly immigrant or white, and the Black communities, which are in the inner city? Why is it such a disparity when we're all Muslims? Why is it that in the suburban community, there is a certain level of pay, but in the inner city, in the Black community, even for staff and leadership, and in the Black community, the imams and them are usually using their own money to survive, to keep the masjids going, when we all got this abundant amount of wealth? When we got doctors and engineers and lawyers and everything, but all that wealth and resources is not used to serve Islam as a complete da'wah. It's to serve us talk, not just theory, but an actual practice of what it's like. From both sides, honest talk. And honest talk sometimes can be a little bit hurtful. It can be a little rough. But if everyone is sincere for the sake of Allah, everyone has a real objective to make Islam, the word of Islam, superior. Oh my God, they cut the long stream off. La ilaha illallah.
No, it's on.
It's on?
Yeah.
Oh, I saw someone said they cut it. And I'll summarize with this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran that He is the one who الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على دين كله ولو كره المشركون. Allah is the one who sent the messenger, Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with the religion, with guidance and the religion of truth, that it will prevail over every way of life, even if those who associate partners with Allah detest it. How are we going to make that reality of Islam reign supreme? How are we going to carry the message of the Quran when Allah tells us, وَاقْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا? Hold on to the rope of Allah as one group together, one group, one congregation, and don't separate. How are we going to make that a reality and not just words we recite in the prayers? We gather and we mention them, but we don't live them. They're not a living reality. And when we have that discussion, when we start to change it and we start to actively work on changing the situation, then we will be a model for others to change the situation in the broader society. And I believe, as our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his companions had to deal with that issue, they overcame it and they changed the world in their time. If we want to change the world in our time, we have to overcome it. We have to deal with it. We can't run from it. And then, as a nation, we can show others the right way and the truthfulness and the justice and the freedom and the equality that is in Islam. Inshallah, these are my thoughts, and we constantly talk about these issues. And I know, and I want to say this in closing, I'm right now in a really rough position. I feel like Malcolm X. I feel like Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. Why do I say that? Because I got to speak on issues that everybody's not guilty of this. Not every immigrant is guilty of what I'm talking about. But it is so abundant that the one who remains silent in the face of it, is a guilty by association. Because when you don't address evil, wrongdoing, you are its partner. Silence in the face of evil, silence in the face of oppression, silence in the face of injustice, silence in the face of wrongdoing, racism, classism is injustice in and of itself. The Prophet ﷺ told us, whoever among you sees an evil, let him change it with his hand. And if he is unable, a condition, وَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ, if he cannot do it, let him change it with his tongue. And if he cannot do it, then let him hate it in his heart, and that is the weakest of faith. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. بارك الله فيكم وجزاكم الله خيرا.
MashaAllah. Brother Amin, thank you so much. Another insightful one. I wish you can go on and on and on, because this is very important to me also. And I do feel your pain. And I know that certain things you have mentioned, I have also experienced it. But alhamdulillah, not significantly in our Al-Falah community, but in other masajid, I have really experienced it even way more than that. So we have a lot to do and we have a lot to learn from each other and to make things better. Now we do have questions and answers for each one of you, in fact. So let me see in terms of order who to go first. Please bear with me. Brother Tariq.
No.
Brother Tariq, they would love to hear your thoughts on police brutality and its effects on the Black community.
My thoughts on police brutality and its effects on the Black community.
Yeah, and then also, what are some ways we as American Muslims who are not Blacks help our fellow brothers and sisters on a regular basis? And also, how can we help the brothers and sisters in prison right now? So just a quick one, and then we move to Dr. Herzig and then Sister Faheema and her husband, and then also Brother Amin. Thank you.
Okay. Similar to kind of what I've said before, and as Imam Amin has alluded to, these are questions, like if I were to be truly honest, there's no way I'm going to be able to answer these questions in any type of real justice, in, this one platform. So in terms of the aspect of police brutality and my thoughts on it, this is something that has unfortunately been a reality for African Americans, Black people in this country, more or less since, the establishment of a policing, outfit. You can say that the early beginnings of police actually began with the slave hunters, who were, sanctioned by, in particular, Southern governmental systems to strategically hunt, African slaves, Black slaves who were trying to obtain their freedom. And so the issue has become is that, you kind of say that the uniforms have changed from, the slave, trader uniform to the, to some of the, blue uniforms. Now, again, this is not to say that, every police officer is, coming from that framework. For example, Imam Amin, his son is a police officer. So this is not to condemn every officer. However, there has been this dichotomy between, the African American community and the police. And so when it comes to police brutality, it's something that, African Americans have been speaking out, about for years. If you go back to, the time of, Malcolm X, he was speaking about the aspect of police brutality back in the 1950s and 60s. If you go, prior to that, you had all these different examples of police brutality, some that was known, some that, went unknown. What I think to myself about it, if someone's asking my personal opinion, is that for every George Floyd, for every Michael Brown, for every, for every African American that you do hear about, how many African Americans do you never hear about? I mean, let's just be honest. We're hearing about the ones where someone happened to have a camera and, put it on YouTube or whatever the case may be. But how many, situations happen, cell phones are, a relatively, new thing where everyone has one, everyone's cell phone has a camera. So my position on it is that, if we're going to do anything about it, this should be a means of, as Imam Amin said, opening up the jar to really have honest discussions about it. So that, now people can see that, Black people were not just, making this up. We weren't just saying that all these things and, not receiving any response from it, that these are real issues that, Black people deal with all the time. this is, one of the aspects of, being African American, this aspect of, when I see a police officer, I'm talking about me personally, when I see a police officer, I'll be quite honest. Yeah, there is an aspect of fear. I don't know what the situation is going to be. I hope, I seen portions of the movie Just Mercy. I actually I prefer reading the book than watching the movie, but I seen the beginning portion of it anyway. And some people may or may not have paid attention to the portion of the movie when he is pulled over by the police. Initially, if you actually look at what he does, is that when he pulls over the police, one of the first things that he does is that he takes his hands and he puts them straight upon the steering wheel. And that is something that as an African American, you start to learn, is that I have to make sure that I put myself in the least threatening manner that I can to order to better protect myself from, any possible harm that may occur. And so these are things that, as Imam Amin, had alluded to, we have to address it. And so my suggestion would be that we have to be consistent. Now, going to the next question, in terms of what can people who are not Black, do to help the situation with African Americans. My, personal suggestion would be to, have these conversations. I was, more or less, asked to, talk about, kind of like the aspect of racism in general in America, but, I, completely agree with the aspect is that, we also have to acknowledge the aspect of racism within the Muslim community. Is that, we have to acknowledge that, yes, there is, this divide between, the African American community. And the thing is that, if I were to be completely honest about it as well, is that it's not just limited to the aspect of the Black community. There's racism between, different immigrant communities. There's racism between, Arabs and non-Arabs, and so on and so forth. But the thing is that, if we continue to kind of pretend like it doesn't exist, or that, oh, that's a minority that I'm not a part of, then it's just going to continue. And so, the best way of doing it is to have forums like this, but not just have it be like a one-time thing. This is what I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is that we'll have this great, uproar that is going on and taking place, and everyone's talking about it. And then a month from now, when everyone's able to go out and, we're not thinking about the coronavirus, the trial hasn't started yet, or whatever the case may be, we just go back to, exactly where we were before. And the unfortunate thing is that a lot of times that's what happens. We get, excited about something, we talk about it, we have these different programs, and then after a while that becomes, old news. We move on to the next, whatever's next in the news media. So that's one of the major ways that we can help. And in terms of the last question, in terms of, assisting in the prison, one of the things that you'll be, amazed to find out is that, prison has its own dynamics, it has its own thing. But one of the things that you can do that some people may have never even thought about is actually just go and volunteer in a prison. As I mentioned before, like in the facility that I work in Newark, New Jersey, the Muslims make up the largest religious group. I mean, if I take all the Christian denominations, within the prison, the Muslims still outnumber them. Now, whether or not, people are fully committed or whatever, that's between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But, by people actually just declaring themselves to be Muslim, the Muslims outnumber every other religious group. So the aspect of, just going and volunteering, and I'm just talking about from the aspect of something basic that someone can do, because the real situation doesn't lie once a person lands in prison. Prison itself has its own issues and things of that nature that have to be addressed. But the greater issue is, removing this prison industrial complex from the society that we live in. And, that's going to take, a lot of, strategical planning and things like that. Like, I'm not going to confess that I have all the answers. I know that these issues, exist, and I'm still myself, trying to figure out, what is the best route to take. But, just from like a basic level of what I can do, you can go into some of these, institutions and volunteer. Even though we have the largest population in the prison system in terms of Muslims, for all intents and purposes, we haven't had a Muslim volunteer since last Ramadan. There was only one brother who used to come as a volunteer, And the last time that he was able to come was last Ramadan. Since then, we haven't had any. And so, like, just doing that, can, be of some assistance. But again, the greater issue is, dealing with the, the prison industrial complex. And that, as Imam Amin, had mentioned, like, all these different things that we're talking about, they, deserve their own, in-depth look that, we don't necessarily have the time to do tonight.
Thank you so much, Brother Tariq. I think the next question we have is, let me see. Sister Faheema and Brother Siddiq.
Yes. Yes.
So we would love to hear Brother Siddiq's thoughts on police brutality and its effects on the Black community.
My. How much time do you have?
You can go about 5 minutes. You have about 3 to 5 minutes.
As was said earlier, it's such a vast topic that you can't do justice to it in a couple of minutes. Needless to say that I'm with an organization of Black law enforcement executives in the neighborhood of about 3,500 across the country. And we fervently denounce law enforcement, police brutality in every community where we serve. We're very active about that here in New Jersey and in our chapter called Noble. When I was in law enforcement proper with my law enforcement agency, for 25 years, I taught at the police academy, so that every police officer that came and was hired by the city of Plainfield, especially, went through the police academy where I taught, and I had a chance to spend 2 days with them, and the second full day was teaching a course called Cultural Diversity, and we delve into police brutality, and my mantra to them was that you're living in a new day, completely different from when I came on the job in 1980, when cell phones didn't exist. I mean, you were excited if you were able to have a pager. Today, even 5-year-olds have cell phones. And I tell those recruits that there is a camera everywhere now. Everyone has a cell phone. ATM machines, bank machines have cameras. Stores have cameras. Municipalities have cameras, street cameras. So you're constantly on camera. Everything that you do nowadays is being recorded. And if you want to have a successful career in law enforcement, be cognizant of the fact that you are on camera, and therefore you should act accordingly as to how you have been properly trained. And yes, there is proper training in the police academies for the most part. It is only when recruits leave the police academies and go back to their respective agencies where they learn the so-called local culture of their police agency. And oftentimes, and I have to say oftentimes now, I didn't used to say that, but now I say oftentimes, those new people come under the influence of more seasoned police officers that have decided that they like the old way of doing things. And thus, it leads to this disparate treatment between the Black community and law enforcement. Not everybody. My daughter is a leader in her agency in Plainfield, and she follows in that same mantra of treating people with respect and she is a Muslim. My son in New York and in Texas carried the same thing, and now he's very active and vocal, speaking out against police brutality. So it's in our family that we stand up for what is right, no matter who it is committing it, no matter whether they're Black or white. We stand against police brutality. I don't know how much you want me to go on that. I do want to say, though, with respect to and follow up with what Imam Muhammad was talking about, when he ran out of time. And I use the word micro aggressions or micro racisms, especially in the Muslim community. And by that, I mean, and he was touching on the fact that a lot of the scholars that come into this country, into these municipalities, they go to the suburbs where the more wealthy masjids and Islamic centers are and teach there, and bypass those indigenous African-American Muslim communities that have been here since the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. In fact, our masjid, Masjid Allah, is the oldest masjid in the city of Plainfield, 50 years. And to this day, sometimes on Fridays when I'm there in the mornings, I'll get a phone call from someone that is does not have a true English or American accent, and they'll ask, "Do you have Juma at your masjid?" And I say, "Excuse me?" And they say, "Do you have Juma at your masjid?" And I have to say, "Yes, we do. It's a masjid." Because they know they're calling to Masjid Allah, which is a predominantly African-American community, but we have a very diverse mix from various countries in the Middle East, and they all respect the African-American leadership at Masjid Allah. And we do have a diverse mix on our Majlis board, so there is representation across the board. I'll stop there unless you want me to keep going.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair. I would have loved for you to keep going. It's never, and it's very, very important for us to hear you guys. But in the essence of time, we have to move on. And inshallah, our next time around, we'll have you to come over and share more insightful experiences. Thank you.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah.
So the next question is for Dr. Herzig. Dr. Herzig, I do have questions, and I also have my own personal one. Maybe I should go with the first ones, and then I'll address my personal question to you. The first one is, having mixed kids. Since you have, your wife is Black and you're white, have your kids experienced any racial issues? And then the other question that was posted was, do you see a difference in a Muslim community or masjid versus a Christian or white community in terms of racism to different races? And so those are these two questions. And then my question to you is, I do have 4 kids. I've been living in Bridgewater for 20 years, alhamdulillah. And with what is happening right now, I've become more of a therapist since my kids were born to boost them of their self-esteem, in the community that we live in. But now it's like I've gotten out of ideas on what to do or how to address and help them, especially my 11-year-old son. So if you do have, since you're a psychologist, if you do have any help or any tips that can help me to be a better therapist to my kids, please do share. Thank you.
So let's see, the first question, or the first part of the question was about my own identity as a dad of multiracial kids.
Yes.
So my wife is kind of like light-skinned African-American. And as a result, our kids they just kind of look tan. I mean, I don't even know the best way to describe it. Like they look kind of racially ambiguous. And so their experience of being, being kids in this country is very different than the experience of, let's say, their cousins who are quite obviously African-American. And so that talk that, my brother-in-law might have to have with his son, the talk about, what do you do when you see a policeman? That is a conversation that I might not have to have, or at least not have to have in the same way. And so in a way, my kids have the privilege of having a certain amount of racial ambiguity. But one thing that they are exposed to is the fact that there are so many different people in their family that they can develop a sense of empathy for all people, because there's a legitimate familial connection to people from all kinds of different backgrounds. And that's something that's very difficult to teach, but that's their upbringing. just by its nature. In terms of racism in other areas of, in other houses of worship, like outside of Islam, yes. I mean, I think the challenging question is, name me a form in America where there is not some kind of racism of some sort, right? And again, even among well-meaning people, we can look at the most progressive of Christian churches or Jewish synagogues. We can look at the most enlightened of political organizations. All of that's fine, but there's still going to be racism there. And that's because it's endemic within the system. And so, you know, when we work toward justice, we try to find the ways that it's ingrained in the system and utilize what the insights that we have relationally and also professionally to address those issues and to forge alliances with people who have similar mindsets. And, you know, with regard to professional identity, talking to kids is so difficult in so many ways. And just because I'm a parent and just because I'm a psychologist doesn't mean I have it all figured out either. Kids tend to do well when they are met with authenticity and unconditional support and love, and you can create a sense of safety within your relationship with those kids. But there's no way that you can monitor all of the information that they're getting and all of the messages that they're being sent. So the main thing is to keep an open dialogue. And as we think about mental health in the Muslim community, we should also think about, you know, even though those of us who are mental health providers are a relatively small number within this community, how can we leverage that professional experience and expertise to meet the needs of the Muslim community itself? Because, you know, there are clearly needs there as well. So like what we did in Boston was myself and Imam, we started up a pro bono counseling clinic, which kind of demystifies the link between Islam and seeking professional mental health services. We based it in a masjid. And we said, you know, you come here without judgment. We respect your Islam and we're willing to speak to you from a professional mental health point of view as well. And we're willing to integrate the two. So when I think about kids who are struggling, kids within the Muslim community, I would ask, what are your communities doing from a mental health perspective to try to meet those needs? Because they're very difficult to meet in any arena. And to expand on that point briefly, you know, just on the topic of what can I as a non-African American individual do to promote the well-being of the African American Muslim community, what I would say is, what is it that is unique to you that you can bring? You know, are you a psychologist? Okay, what can you do to set up mental health support within that community? Are you a lawyer? Okay, do you have services that you can provide to people who are underrepresented legally and who may be targets of discrimination, either on the basis of race and religion? Or are you a business person? If that's the case, you know, can you help get that masjid that's struggling, that masjid that the scholars don't go to and that doesn't have the $1 million fundraisers, can you go to that masjid and say, hey, let's work on a long-term financial plan for you that will allow you to operate according to your mission and your values and with a sense of autonomy. So I would just say, think about anything unique that you can offer and then figure out where you fit in.
Thank you so much. Jazakallah khairan, Brother Herzig. And finally, a question for Imam Amin Muhammad. Imam Amin, are you there?
Hello?
Hello, I can hear you. We can hear you. Yes, good, mashallah. Thank you. So Imam Amin, we do have a question for you, and also we would like you to complete this for us in a nice, with a nice dua, inshallah. So the question will be that if you can please advise us on what to do and how to reconcile when some of the activist organizations such as Black Lives Matters, include pro-LGBTQ positions in their mission statements?
That's it? Okay.
That's one out of two.
That's one question? Or that's all the questions?
No, that's one out of two.
Okay.
The second one is about how do we fix for our community that is quite new, for the Bridgewater community that is quite new, how do we make sure that all the important topics you have discussed about how Blacks experience racism in different types of, whether it's an Arab community or Indo-Pak community, how do we start to tackle that so that this doesn't become or affect us, so that we can fix this and then hopefully we set precedents and then we can be able to, other masajid around us can be able to follow suit, inshallah.
Okay, Bismillah. From the first one, and I think the first one and the second one, it can cover it. The most important thing has to be to us is al-Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He told us in the Quran, Inna ad-deen inda Allah al-Islam, that the religion, the way of life that is acceptable to Allah is Islam. So for all of us, Islam and the upliftment of Islam and the implementation of Islam needs to be the most important thing in our lives. That's number one. So when we're dealing with the others, we weigh everything on the scale of Islam. So we look at something as good, bad, beneficial, harmful, according to what Islam tells us. And we have to be wise, but unapologetic. Wise in terms of we realize that we're in a society that the way it exists is contradicting the sacred law of Islam in its form as it exists. So the wisdom is, how do we use Islam to slowly change the bad aspects of the society? So when we look at LGBT, Islamically, we must realize that that is something that is not permissible. And we cannot apologize for that. So that's one step. From the side of the religious law, this is something that Islam, by scholarly consensus, well known in the Quran and Sunnah, this is not something that we can agree with. However, how do we deal with the people who are afflicted with this contradiction of Islamic laws? That's how we deal with other people. We deal with other people with mercy and understanding and trying to reason with them. These are what we need to do. So when we're dealing with Black Lives Matter, like what happened just a few days, you'll see a video going around where I confronted this type of situation. And I explained to them, Islam tells us that everyone, that's one of the objectives of Islam, deserves protection of their life, protection of their property, protection of their reputation, protection of their religion, protection of their intellect, their protection of their genealogy. All these things Islam came to protect. So everyone shares in that. However, just as Islam came to protect that, there is the protecting of the whole of the humanity and not just a segment. The laws of Islam come to protect the whole of humanity, not just one particular group. What has happened in our society is that sometimes the individual concern has overwhelmed the concern or the benefit of the majority. And that based on lobbying, politics, wealth, and all these different things that attribute to one segment of the society being able to push their will on the rest of the society. So that is a way of dialogue and reasoning. So that's how I believe Islamically we should handle these interactions with those who have alternative lifestyles that may not agree with the Islamic law. The second question is, how do your community as a community in a suburban community or a community that's dominated by immigrant Muslims, ensure that they don't run into these conflicts with the dual Islamic societies that we have. I'll give you 5 quick things, and I'll name them quick for sake of time. Number one, recognize the legitimacy of the Islam of the Black Americans who have been practicing Islam in America for almost 100 years as Muslims. And many Muslims have been following the Quran and Sunnah for generations. For instance, in my family alone, we have 3 generations of practicing Sunni Muslims. So when our brother Siddiq mentioned that someone called a masjid, and asked, do they have Juma in a masjid? That is not only wrong, it's insulting to the one who says, I've been a Muslim all my life, basically. My children don't know nothing but Islam. My grandchildren don't know nothing but Islam. And I'll give you something, and you might not even pay attention, but we are sensitive to this. You introduced me. You said Imam Ameer Muhammad. You talked about all the places I studied, right? And then in your discussion, you said, Brother Amin. I wonder how many times has Black Americans faced that question? It's subconscious. We didn't even think about it. But do you go to the Imam of your masjid and say to him, brother, you call him Imam or Sheikh, right? It's these things that we gotta fix. It's these type of things, they're subconscious, because they become a norm by degrading or underestimating the legitimacy of the Islam of Black Americans. It's subconscious, it's systemic, and sometimes it happens without us even realizing it's happening. But we, on the other hand, we feel it, we understand it, we get that kind of sensitivity, not unjustly, because it happens. Secondly, don't try to take over the discourse. Just like if you have people who are professionals in areas, you defer to them. Black Americans are professionals in dealing with white systemic racism, white supremacy. It is through Black Americans that immigrants got the platforms they got. In Islam, it was Black Americans in America who struggled to establish Islam in this country, and you're coming off the back of that. Recognize that. Number three, excuse me, have a discussion, open discussions on the table, all the issues. Go visit one another, have real panels with real discussion. Once you get through the pain, you'll get to the joy and the pleasure of Islamic brotherhood. The next thing, admitting when you are mistaken, admitting when you are wrong, admitting when you have not done the proper thing. Be able to admit that, even if it is not comfortable. The next thing, rectify it, change it, correct it. And if I saw one question you didn't ask, so I'll add it. What can people in the Muslim community living in the suburbs do to strengthen our brotherhood and in the urban Muslim communities? Share your resources. Share your professional resources, share your economic resources, and allow your brothers and sisters in Islam to become empowered, to become independent. Show them your true brotherhood, and they are already inclined to show you brotherhood, but make it an equal meeting of people, and you can erase that problem, and Allah knows best.
MashaAllah, thank you so much, Imam Amin. And just to tell you this about myself also, there are so many things that even between a Black person to another Black person, I can also make mistakes, and maybe because of where I have lived for so long and make mistakes without even knowing it. So I'm glad that you touch base on these topics, even for myself, to improve myself, to my fellow Black people, and also to the Muslim Ummah in general. We'll be having these important discussions for the months and years to come. And we hope that each one of you can be able to join us. And we sincerely hope that you'll be able to join us not only once a year, Imam Amin, or all the other panelists, because I know that your time is very precious and you are busy and you are called in so many areas around the country. So inshallah, all of us together, we can understand one another. We can really, if we try and practice humility, we can really, I strongly feel that this is a wake-up call for us, and we can really understand one another and also educate each other and unite to tackle the difficult and very, very real problem of racism. Thank you, Brother Herzig. Thank you, Sister Faheema, Brother Siddiq, Brother Tariq, Brother Amin, and Imam Ameer. Thank you so much. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Barakallahu feekum.
Please, can you please conclude with a dua for us, please?
I'll make it short. ربنا أتمم لنا نورنا واغفر لنا إنك على كل شيء قدير. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. ربنا إنك جامع الناس ليوم لا ريب فيه إن الله لا يخلف الميعاد. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين بسير الأسرار الفاتحة.
Ameer.
Ameer. Alhamdulillah.
Zainab, you're on mute.
Thank you to each one of you who joined us, and we hope that inshallah you can be able to join us in our upcoming other lectures, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.